All right, let's dive into the world of nationwide injunctions. We got an article about this big Supreme Court decision from just days ago on March 14th, 2025.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's titled The 2025 Supreme Court Ruling, A New Era for Nationwide Injunctions.
Right.
And people are really talking about it.
Yeah.
So let's try to break it down together. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating area of law, especially with this new ruling.
Yeah.
This single ruling could completely change how laws are challenged and how they're applied across the whole U.S.
It does feel like we're on the verge of like a whole new era of legal battles. But before we get into all of that, can you kind of explain for our listener what a nationwide injunction is and why it's such a big deal?
Sure. Imagine a federal law is passed, right?
Yeah.
And you think it's unjust.
Okay.
Now imagine a single court order that stops that law from being enforced everywhere in the country.
Wow.
That's a nationwide injunction.
Okay.
And it's different from a typical injunction, which usually only affects a specific area or a certain group of people.
Okay, so it's like hitting the pause button on a law for the whole country just because one court decides to do that. That sounds incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it is powerful. If you think back to the Trump-era travel ban,
Right.
nationwide injunctions issued by federal judges were a big reason why those policies didn't go into effect right away.
So you're saying like a single judge could block a presidential order across the entire U.S.?
Yeah.
I can see why this would be controversial. And the article talks about the arguments for and against nationwide injunctions. So can you walk me through those?
Yeah, definitely. So the critics of nationwide injunctions say that they give way too much power to individual judges. They argue that it can really upset the balance of power in our government.
Right.
And it can undermine the authority of the president and Congress.
Right, because we have a system of checks and balances for a reason, right?
Exactly.
But the article also mentions arguments in favor of nationwide injunctions.
Oh,
what are those?
Yeah. Supporters say these injunctions are really important for protecting individual rights, especially when the government is doing things that could be harmful.
Right.
They say they're really a critical safeguard against the government overreaching and abusing its power.
So it's kind of this like debate between how much power should judges have and how do we make sure that individual rights are protected.
Exactly.
And that's where the Supreme Court ruling comes in, right?
Exactly, yeah. The court decided to limit the use of these nationwide injunctions and make it a lot harder for federal judges to issue them. They said judges need to be more careful and really only issue these broad injunctions in very specific situations.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, it's going to be a lot tougher to challenge a federal law or policy and get it blocked all across the country.
Yes, that's right.
So what exactly led the Supreme Court to make this decision? What were they thinking?
Well, they were concerned about a few things. First, they felt that nationwide injunctions were being used too often, especially in response to policies from recent presidents that have caused a lot of controversy.
So they saw it as kind of a trend that needed to be addressed?
Exactly. And they also were concerned that these nationwide injunctions could create like a confusing patchwork of laws across the country. Imagine different courts issuing different injunctions. It would just be chaos.
Yeah, no, I get it. That would really undermine the idea that we have consistent laws throughout the United States. So it sounds like they're trying to bring more order to the legal system.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But it's not just about making things neat and tidy.
Okay.
This really has massive implications for how laws are challenged and how they're enforced.
Right.
And really for the balance of power in our government as a whole.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a turning point. Now, the article also mentions some specific legal concepts that are really key to understanding this whole ruling. And one of them is, like, this idea of standing. Can you explain what standing is in plain English?
Sure. Standing is basically the right to bring a lawsuit to court.
Okay.
You can't just sue anybody for anything.
Right.
You have to show that you have a real reason to be involved in the case.
So it's like a filter to make sure that only people who are actually affected by a law or a policy can challenge it in court.
That's right. And the Supreme Court really emphasized that judges need to carefully consider who has standing to sue when they're thinking about issuing one of these nationwide injunctions.
Interesting. So if you want to challenge a federal law, you not only have to show that it's bad or harmful, but you also have to prove that you yourself are being harmed by it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is where things get really interesting. Because this ties into this concept of jurisdiction.
Jurisdiction.
Which is another big idea in this ruling. Jurisdiction means the authority of a court
Oh.
to even hear a case and make a decision.
So it's about which court actually has the power to make a ruling in the first place.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court stressed that lower courts shouldn't be issuing these nationwide injunctions that go way beyond their own specific geographic area of authority.
So they're basically saying, like, stay in your lane.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
They want lower courts to focus on resolving disputes in their own jurisdictions
Okay.
and not try to make big decisions that affect the whole country.
So it sounds like the Supreme Court is really trying to draw some clear boundaries and limit how much power an individual judge can have.
Right.
But what does this really mean for people who want to challenge federal laws they think are unjust?
Yeah.
Will this make it harder for them to actually get justice?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
And it's something that we're going to explore more as we dive deeper into this ruling and talk about the potential consequences.
Well, you've got me curious.
Great.
So let's move on to part 2 and explore those potential consequences in more detail.
Sounds good. This ruling could really change things in a big way. Let's think about what it might mean for you, the listener, and for anybody who cares about how laws are made and how they're challenged in this country.
I'm really curious about that. You know, we've talked about all the technical stuff, but what about the real world? Like, what's going to happen?
Right.
The article says this decision could really change how lawyers approach legal challenges going forward.
Absolutely. So if you're a lawyer and you're fighting a federal policy that you think is unjust, your strategy is going to have to change.
Yeah.
Because before this ruling, you might have aimed for a nationwide injunction, right?
Right.
To block that policy everywhere in the U.S. But now you can't really do that in most cases.
So what are the alternatives? What can lawyers do?
Well, they might try to bring multiple lawsuits, like in specific states or regions, kind of targeting areas where they think they have the best chance of winning.
So instead of this big nationwide battle, it's more like a bunch of smaller local fights.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And it could lead to, different parts of the country having different rules or different interpretations of the law.
So that sounds messy.
Yeah.
Is there anything good about that?
Well, some people might say that it allows for more flexibility.
Okay.
Different states might have different priorities, right?
Yep.
And different circumstances. So it allows for tailored legal approaches.
So it's like instead of one size fits all, you can have more of a custom solution.
Exactly.
But couldn't that also create confusion?
Yeah.
For people who need to know what the law is?
Yeah, that's a valid concern, and it's something we'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah.
But the article also points out that this decision could have big effects outside of the courtroom as well, like how the government works.
Oh, how so?
Well, if presidents and federal agencies know that they're not as likely to face these immediate nationwide roadblocks from the courts, they might be more likely to go ahead with more controversial policies.
So they're not as afraid of being stopped right away?
Yeah.
So that could lead to more bold actions from the executive branch?
Exactly.
That's a pretty big shift in power.
It is, yeah. And it raises questions about accountability.
Yeah.
If it's harder to challenge federal policies in court, how do we make sure that the government is still listening to the people?
That's a good question. The article also talked about some potential long-term effects in specific areas like immigration, healthcare, and environmental regulations.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So take immigration, for example.
Okay.
Imagine a new federal policy that makes it really hard for some people to come to the U.S. and seek asylum.
Okay.
Before this ruling, a nationwide injunction might have stopped that policy while it was being challenged in court. Now, that's probably not going to happen.
So that means that policy would just go into effect even if there were serious concerns about whether it was legal or how it would affect vulnerable people.
That's right. And people who oppose that policy would have to fight it state by state.
Oh, wow.
Which could take a really long time.
Yeah, that seems like it would be a much harder battle to fight.
Yeah, exactly.
And this would apply to other areas as well, right?
Yeah, like healthcare or environmental protection. Imagine a new regulation that weakens protections for clean air or water.
Right.
It might be really hard to block that nationwide now.
Wow.
And communities would have to deal with those effects while legal challenges go through the courts.
This is a lot to take in. It feels like this ruling has a lot of consequences, both good and bad.
I think that's fair to say. There are a lot of unknowns.
Yeah.
And we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out over time.
The article doesn't really get into specific cases, but I'm sure lawyers and legal scholars are already thinking about what this means for their work.
Oh, for sure. This is going to be a big topic for a long time. And it's important for everyone, not just lawyers,
Yeah.
to understand what's at stake.
Right.
This ruling is about fundamental questions of power, rights, and how our government works.
So it's not just some abstract legal debate. It affects us all.
Exactly.
I'm ready to hear more about the reactions to this ruling. I bet people have some strong opinions.
Oh, yeah, for sure. This ruling is definitely controversial. We need to understand the arguments from both sides.
Yeah.
Both those who support it and those who oppose it.
Right. Let's dive into those perspectives in part 3. Yeah, it does seem like people could have really different opinions on this, and I'll be totally reasonable.
Right.
The article talks about some pretty strong reactions on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
What are people saying?
Well, the people who support the ruling, they see it as a correction,
Yeah.
something that needed to happen. Yep. They say nationwide injunctions were being used way too much, and we're messing up the balance of power in our government.
So they're basically saying this ruling stops the courts from having too much power.
Yeah, exactly. They believe too much power had gone to the courts, and this ruling gives some of that power back to the president and Congress.
Okay.
So they can do their jobs, like making laws and stuff, without the courts interfering too much.
And they probably also like that laws will be applied more consistently across the country, right?
Yeah, definitely. They argue that this ruling will make things more predictable
Okay.
and create a more stable legal system, which is good for everyone.
But I bet the people who don't like this ruling have some big concerns, too.
Oh, yeah, they definitely do.
What are they worried about?
Well, they're worried that this ruling weakens one of the most important checks on the government's power.
Okay.
The ability of the courts to step in and protect people's rights when the government is doing things that could hurt them.
So they're worried that the government has too much power now.
That's their biggest worry, yeah. They're afraid that the president and federal agencies will be able to get away with more.
Right.
Especially when it comes to policies that could harm certain groups of people, because it's going to be a lot harder to challenge those policies in court.
It almost sounds like they think this ruling goes against, like, the basic idea of checks and balances.
Yeah, that's how a lot of legal experts and advocacy groups feel. They're really concerned about what this means for the future.
This is complicated stuff. It's not just about legal details, right?
Yeah, not at all.
It's about who has power and what rights we have and how our democracy actually works.
Right, exactly. And we all need to be part of these conversations, think about the arguments from both sides, and really consider what this ruling means for our country.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the most important thing is that this ruling is a huge deal. It's a big shift in how power is shared in our government, and it's going to affect how laws are made and enforced for a long time.
And it reminds us that these legal decisions aren't just abstract ideas, right?
Right.
They have real effects on people's lives.
Exactly. This ruling could affect so many things, from immigration to the environment to healthcare and education.
It's a lot.
Yeah. We all need to stay informed, talk about these issues, and hold our leaders accountable.
I agree. This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for breaking down this complex issue for us.
You're welcome. I'm glad we could talk about it.
And to our listener, thanks for suggesting this topic for our deep dive.
Yeah.
We hope this conversation has helped you understand nationwide injunctions better and what the Supreme Court ruling might mean for all of us. Until next time, keep asking those great questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.